The telegram arrived on a Tuesday and destroyed everything Clara Whitmore thought she knew about survival. 3 weeks later, she stood in a dying Colorado valley, staring at a ranch that looked like God's cruelest joke, if he bothered with jokes at all. The cattle were skeletal, the fences were rotting, the debts could drown her twice over, and the silent cowboy watching from the neighboring property. He looked at her the way you look at a lamb wandering into a slaughterhouse. She had two choices: run back to the city that had already broken her, or stay and let this land finish the job. If you want to see how Clara survives what comes next, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach hit another rut, and Clara's head cracked against the wooden frame hard enough to make her see stars. She didn't complain. Complaining required energy she couldn't spare, and besides, the other passenger, a whiskey drummer with tobacco-stained teeth, had already made it clear he thought women shouldn't travel alone, especially not women heading to the back end of nowhere with nothing but a battered trunk and desperation in their eyes. Clara pressed her forehead against the grimy window and watched Colorado unfold in shades of brown and gray. The mountains in the distance looked like broken teeth against a sky too big to comprehend. She'd lived her entire 26 years in Philadelphia, where the sky was something that happened between buildings, where the loudest sound was iron wheels on cobblestone, where she knew every street corner and back alley by heart. This place was different. This place was vast and empty, and utterly indifferent to whether she lived or died. The telegram was still in her coat pocket, though she'd memorized every word 3 weeks ago. She pulled it out anyway, unfolded it with fingers that had calluses from pushing needles through thick fabric, but would soon learn entirely different kinds of pain. Clara Whitmore. Stop. Your Uncle Jonathan deceased. Stop. Property. Valley Creek Ranch. Colorado. Now yours. Stop. Come immediately. Stop. Lawyer. James Mitchell. Uncle Jonathan. She'd met him exactly twice in her life. Once when she was 7 and he'd passed through Philadelphia smelling of leather and tobacco, and once at her father's funeral when she was 12. He'd stood at the back of the church, uncomfortable in a suit that didn't fit, and left before the reception. Her mother had called him that wild brother who chose cattle over civilization, and that was the last Clara heard of him for 14 years. Now he was dead, and somehow, impossibly, he'd left everything to her. Valley Creek, the driver shouted back through the coach. 15 minutes. The whiskey drummer snorted. Valley Creek, that's generous. More like Valley Corpse these days. Clara turned from the window. What do you mean? He grinned, showing those terrible teeth. You don't know? The whole valley's dying, miss. Been dying for 5 years. Drought, cattle disease, the railroad choosing a different route. Take your pick. Most of the ranchers already gave up and moved on. The ones who stayed are too stubborn or too broke to leave. He leaned forward, and she smelled the whiskey on his breath. So which one was your kin, stubborn or broke? Both, I imagine, Clara said quietly. The drummer laughed like she'd told a joke. The stagecoach crested a ridge, and suddenly the valley opened below them like a wound in the earth. Clara's breath caught, not from beauty, though there was a harsh kind of beauty to it, but from the sheer scale of emptiness. Miles and miles of brown grass, a creek that looked more like a scar than a water source, and scattered across it all, the bones of what had once been prosperous ranches. She could see her inheritance from here. Even without knowing which property was hers, she could see it. The sagging barn, the house with part of the roof missing, the fence posts leaning like drunks. The cattle, and there weren't many, clustered near the creek, ribs showing through their hides. That'd be the Whitmore place, the drummer said, following her gaze. The one that looks like it's praying for a strong wind to put it out of its misery. Clara said nothing. What could she say? He was right. The town of Valley Creek consisted of one street. One muddy, rutted street with buildings clustered along it like survivors huddling for warmth. A general store, a saloon, a church with peeling paint. A building that advertised itself as J. Mitchell, attorney at law, in faded letters. A few houses scattered beyond, and that was it. The entire town probably held fewer people than lived on Clara's block back in Philadelphia. The stagecoach stopped in front of the general store, and the driver climbed down to help with the luggage. Clara stepped out into ankle-deep mud and immediately felt every eye in town turn toward her. She was used to being looked at in the city, A woman alone attracted attention, but this was different. These stares weren't curious or appraising. They were calculating, measuring, deciding how long she'd last. "You'd be Miss Whitmore," a voice said. Clara turned to find a thin man in a suit that had seen better days approaching from the lawyer's office. He was perhaps 50, with gray hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from witnessing too many failures. "Mr. Mitchell?" "James Mitchell, yes." He didn't offer his hand, which told Clara everything about how women were regarded here. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Clara pulled her coat tighter against a wind that cut through the fabric like it wasn't there. "I received your telegram." "Then you know the situation." Mitchell gestured toward his office. "We should talk inside. It's complicated." Complicated turned out to be a generous word for catastrophic. Mitchell's office was cramped and cold, heated by a stove that was putting out more smoke than warmth. He offered Clara a chair that wobbled and sat behind a desk covered in papers that looked like legal accusations. "Your uncle," Mitchell began, then paused, choosing his words carefully, "was a difficult man, proud, stubborn. He refused help even when it became clear the ranch was failing." "How bad is it?" Clara asked. She'd learned in Philadelphia that bad news didn't improve with decoration. Mitchell opened a ledger and turned it toward her. The numbers swam before Clara's eyes. Debts in red ink, assets in black ink that was far too pale. She wasn't skilled in accounting, but she understood the fundamental arithmetic of disaster. The ranch is mortgaged to the bank. Your uncle took out loans to buy cattle that died in the drought 3 years ago. He borrowed more to drill a well that came up dry. The fence repairs alone would cost more than the current value of the livestock. Mitchell looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Miss Whitmore, I'll be direct. The kindest thing you could do is sign the property over to the bank, take what little remains after the debts are settled, and return to wherever you came from." "How much would remain?" "Perhaps $50, perhaps nothing." Clara sat back in the wobbling chair. $50. She'd left Philadelphia with $73 to her name, every penny she'd saved from 2 years of sewing 12 hours a day in a factory that treated its workers like replaceable parts. She'd spent $18 on the journey here. That left her with $55 and change. "What if I don't sign it over?" she asked. Mitchell blinked. "I'm sorry?" "What if I keep the ranch?" "What would that require?" For a long moment, the lawyer just stared at her. Then he leaned forward, and for the first time, his tired eyes showed something other than resignation. They showed concern. "Miss Whitmore, do you know anything about ranching?" "No." "Do you know anything about cattle, horses, fence repair, well drilling, hay cultivation, or surviving a Colorado winter?" "No." "Can you even ride a horse?" "No." Mitchell closed the ledger with a sound like a coffin shutting. "Then keeping the ranch would be suicide. Not metaphorical suicide. Actual, literal death. This valley kills people, Miss Whitmore. It killed your uncle. It'll kill you faster because at least he knew what he was doing." Clara looked down at her hands. They were seamstress hands, nimble, precise, marked with tiny scars from needle pricks. Useless hands for the kind of work Mitchell was describing. She thought about Philadelphia, about the factory where she'd spent the last 2 years, about the boarding house room she'd shared with 3 other women, about the streets that had become dangerous after dark, about the man who'd promised to marry her and then disappeared with her savings. Everything she'd managed to keep hidden from the factory bosses who would have docked her pay to cover the loss. She thought about having nothing and being nothing and going back to nothing. "I'd like to see the property," Clara said. Mitchell's eyebrows rose. "Now? Is there a better time?" He studied her for another long moment, then sighed and stood. "I'll arrange for a wagon, but Miss Whitmore, seeing it won't change the mathematics. Sentiment doesn't pay debts." "I understand." But she didn't, not really, not yet. The wagon ride to the ranch took 20 minutes along a road that barely deserved the name. Mitchell drove, pointing out landmarks with the enthusiasm of a man identifying graves. That was the Peterson Ranch. They left 2 years ago. Bank foreclosed. That there was the Yates property, sold for 1/10 of what they paid. The Hendersons held out until last spring. Then the wife died in childbirth, and Henderson just walked away. Left everything. Clara absorbed this litany of failure in silence. The valley might have been beautiful once. She could see hints of it in the way the mountains framed the grassland, in the cottonwoods along the creek. But now it just looked haunted, like the land itself was grieving. Then they crested a small rise, and Mitchell pulled the wagon to a stop. "That's it," he said quietly. "The Whitmore Ranch." Clara had seen it from the stagecoach, but distance had been merciful. Up close, the devastation was complete. The house was a two-story structure that might have been handsome 30 years ago. Now the porch sagged. Several windows were broken and covered with boards, and part of the roof had collapsed, leaving the second floor exposed to the weather. The barn was in even worse shape. The doors hung crooked, the hayloft was empty, and she could see daylight through gaps in the walls. The corrals were a disaster of broken rails and rotting posts. The equipment scattered around the property, a rusted plow, a wagon with two wheels missing, tools lying where they'd been dropped, looked like the scattered bones of something that had died badly. And the cattle. There were perhaps 30 head clustered near a water trough that was green with algae. They were Herefords, she thought. She'd seen pictures, but so thin their ribs showed through like xylophone keys. Several were limping. One was lying down in a way that suggested it wouldn't be getting up again. "Your uncle died 3 weeks ago," Mitchell said. "Heart gave out while he was trying to fix the barn roof. He lay there for 2 days before anyone found him. The neighbors have been keeping an eye on the cattle since then, but," he gestured helplessly at the scene, "there's only so much charity people can spare when they're barely surviving themselves." Clara climbed down from the wagon. Her city boots, the nice ones she'd saved for church, sank into mud mixed with manure. The smell hit her like a fist. Decomposition, animal waste, and underneath it all, the sour smell of failure. She walked toward the house, aware of Mitchell following at a distance, probably ready to catch her when she fainted or broke down crying. The front door was unlocked. Who bothered locking anything out here? And swung open with a shriek of rusted hinges. The inside was worse than the outside. Her uncle had lived alone, and it showed. The main room was kitchen, dining area, and living space all combined, and all equally filthy. Dirty dishes were stacked in a basin that had no running water. The stove was caked with grease. The table was covered in papers, bills, notices from the bank, letters that had never been answered. The furniture was minimal and broken, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, a bed in the corner with a mattress that mice had made their home, a trunk that probably held everything Jonathan Whitmore owned at the end. The second floor was uninhabitable. The collapsed roof had let in rain and snow, and the rooms up there were destroyed. Clara stood in the middle of the main room and tried to imagine living here, tried to imagine making this habitable, tried to imagine herself transformed into the kind of person who could save this place. She couldn't do it. "I've seen enough," she said quietly. Mitchell nodded, looking relieved. "I'll have the papers ready for you to sign tomorrow. The hotel in town isn't much, but it's clean, and I've seen enough to know where to start." The lawyer froze. "Miss Whitmore, surely you're not—" "I'd like to stay here tonight," Clara continued. "I'll need to buy supplies in town tomorrow, cleaning supplies first. Then I'll need to know who can teach me about cattle." "You can't be serious." Clara turned to face him, and something in her expression made him step back. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something harder and colder. The look of a woman who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. "Mr. Mitchell, I have $55, no skills for this life, and no idea what I'm doing. If I go back to Philadelphia, I have maybe 3 months before that money runs out. Then what? Another factory job until my hands give out or my lungs fill with dust? Another boarding house where I share a bed with strangers? Another man who promises the world and steals what little I have?" She shook her head. "At least here, if I fail, it'll be my failure, my choice. Can you understand that?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Your uncle said almost the exact same thing to me 5 years ago, right before the drought started." "Did it change your advice?" "No, he was wrong to stay. This valley destroyed him." "Then I'll probably be wrong too." Clara looked around the ruined room. "But I'm staying anyway." After Mitchell left, still shaking his head, still certain she was committing suicide by stubbornness, Clara spent the last hour of daylight trying to make the house marginally habitable. She found a broom with half its bristles missing and swept out the worst of the dirt and mouse droppings. She discovered a well behind the house that still had water, though she had to crank the rusty pump for 5 minutes before it flowed. She carried bucket after bucket inside and heated them on the stove, which took another hour to figure out. By the time true darkness fell, she'd managed to clean one corner of the room enough to sleep in. She spread her coat on the floor, the bed was unusable, and lay down with her trunk as a pillow. The sounds of the night were nothing like Philadelphia. No voices, no wagon wheels, no distant music from saloons. Instead, wind through broken boards, mice in the walls, the occasional low call of cattle, and underneath it all, a silence so profound it felt like pressure against her ears. Clara stared up at the ceiling, at the stars visible through gaps in the roof, and felt the full weight of her decision settle over her like a burial shroud. She had no idea how to do this. None. She couldn't ride, couldn't rope, couldn't fix fences, couldn't read the weather or the cattle or the land. She had city skills in a place that would punish her for every moment of ignorance. And yet there was something almost liberating about being this far beyond her depth. In Philadelphia, she'd always been one disaster away from destitution, always scrambling, always afraid. Here, the disaster had already happened. The worst had already come. There was nowhere to fall because she was already at the bottom. All that remained was whether she could climb. She must have slept because she was startled awake by the sound of hoofbeats. Clara sat up, disoriented, and saw gray light leaking through the windows. Dawn. Her body ached from sleeping on the floor, and her breath misted in the cold air. The hoofbeats stopped outside. Clara stood, wrapping her coat around herself, and moved to the window. Through the dirty glass, she could see a man on horseback, silhouetted against the rising sun. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat pulled low and a coat that had seen hard use. He sat his horse with the kind of easy confidence that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. He was staring at the house. Clara opened the door, and the man's attention shifted to her immediately. Even in the dim light, she could see his face, weathered, hard, with eyes that were evaluating her the way someone might evaluate livestock at market. "You're the niece," he said. Not a question. "Clara Whitmore." He nodded once, a minimal gesture. "Ethan Hale. I ranch the property north of here." "You're my neighbor?" "If you can call 2 miles of empty land neighborly." His voice was rough, unused to conversation. "Saw the smoke from your stove last night. Wanted to see if it was you or scavengers." Clara felt a flash of irritation. And if it had been scavengers? Then I'd have told them to hurry up. Place needs clearing out anyway. He looked past her at the house, and his expression didn't change, but somehow she knew he was cataloging every failure, every collapsed board, every broken window. "You planning to stay?" "Yes." "For how long?" "As long as it takes." Ethan Hale's eyes came back to her, and for the first time she saw something other than cold evaluation in them. It might have been surprise, or possibly disbelief. "Do you know anything about ranching, Miss Whitmore?" "No." "Can you ride?" "No." "Can you rope brand, mend fence, shoe a horse, birth a calf, treat screwworm, read weather, or survive a Colorado winter?" "No." He was silent for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Then you're going to die out here." Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear, she was already afraid. This was something else, certainty, maybe, or determination. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm going to try anyway. And Mr. Hale, if you came here to tell me to give up, you've wasted a ride. I've already had that conversation with the lawyer, the stagecoach driver, and myself about 100 times. The answer is the same." Hale studied her for a long moment. In the growing light, she could see more of him now. A man perhaps in his mid-30s with dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone, and hands that were scarred and calloused from work that would destroy her own soft fingers. "The cattle need feeding," he said finally. "There's hay in my barn. I'll bring some over." Clara blinked. "Why would you do that?" "Because they're starving, and I don't like watching animals suffer." He gathered his reins. "Don't mistake it for charity, Miss Whitmore. I'm not helping you. I'm helping them." "I can't pay you." "I know." Then why? Because your uncle, for all his pride and stubbornness, was still a man who tried. That counts for something. Hale turned his horse. I'll be back in an hour. He rode away before Clara could respond, disappearing into the gray morning like something she might have imagined. She stood on the sagging porch, shivering in the cold, and looked out at the ranch, her ranch, though the words still felt impossible. The cattle were stirring near the water trough, their breath misting in the dawn air. The barn stood like a broken promise. The fence posts leaned like old men waiting to fall. Everything here was dying or dead. Everything except her. Clara went back inside, built up the fire in the stove, and began to plan. She had $55, no skills, and a neighbor who thought she was going to die. She had a town that had already written her off, and a valley that had killed everyone who tried to tame it. She had absolutely no reason to believe she could succeed. But she was going to try anyway. Because the alternative, going back to Philadelphia, to the factory, to the boarding house, to the slow grinding poverty that would eventually break her, was its own kind of death. At least here, if she failed, it would be spectacular. At least here, she'd fail on her own terms. Through the window, she saw Ethan Hale returning, a wagon loaded with hay following behind him. He didn't look toward the house, just started distributing the feed to the cattle with efficient, practiced movements. Clara watched him work, memorizing every motion, every technique. She'd told him the truth. She knew nothing about this life. But she could learn. She had to learn, because this dying ranch, this forgotten valley, this impossible situation, it was all she had left. And she'd be damned if she'd let it kill her without a fight. Ethan Hale didn't speak while he worked, and Clara didn't interrupt. She stood on the porch, wrapped in her coat, watching him move between the cattle with a fluidity that made it look effortless. He'd pitch hay from the wagon, and the animals would crowd around, their skeletal frames pressing against each other for access to food they desperately needed. He checked each one as he worked, running his hands along their sides, examining their eyes and mouths with quick, practiced efficiency. When the hay was distributed, he walked the fence line, testing posts, noting weak points. He didn't write anything down, but Clara understood he was cataloging every failure, building a mental inventory of everything that needed fixing, which was everything. Finally, he turned toward the house. Clara descended the porch steps, her city boots squelching in the mud. "Thank you," she said. Hale nodded. "You've got about 3 days of feed there. After that, they'll need more." "I'll figure something out." His expression didn't change, but she saw skepticism in his eyes. "Will you?" "I have to." He studied her for a moment, then walked to his horse and mounted in one smooth motion. "The land doesn't care about have to, Miss Whitmore. It only cares about can or can't." He gathered the reins. "Your fence posts are rotted through in 12 places that I could see. Your water trough is contaminated. You've got at least 3 head with hoof rot, and that one by the barn probably won't make it through the week. Your barn roof is one strong wind away from collapse, and your house isn't much better." Clara felt each word like a physical blow, but she kept her face neutral. "Is that all?" "No, but it's enough to start with." He turned his horse. "Mitchell's right. You should sell and leave." "I'm not leaving." "Then you're a fool." "Probably," Clara agreed, "but I'm a fool with a ranch." Something that might have been the ghost of respect flickered across Hale's face, or maybe she imagined it. "When you change your mind, my offer stands. I'll buy the property for what the bank would give you, save you the paperwork." He rode away before she could respond, and Clara was left standing in the mud, surrounded by broken fences and dying cattle and the overwhelming evidence of her own inadequacy. She spent the rest of that first day trying to clean the house into something resembling livable. The work was harder than anything she'd done in the factory. There, she'd sat at a table for 12 hours, pushing a needle through fabric until her fingers cramped and her eyes burned. This was different. This was hauling water from the well until her shoulders screamed, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees until her back seized, carrying out debris and refuse until blisters formed on her soft palms. By nightfall, she'd managed to make the main room almost clean. The table was scrubbed, the dishes washed, the stove degreased enough to cook on. She'd found supplies in her uncle's trunk. Flour weevil infested but salvageable, dried beans, coffee that was stale but drinkable, salt pork that was more salt than pork. She made a meal that was barely edible and ate it sitting at the table, too exhausted to taste it properly. The mice came out after dark. She could hear them in the walls, skittering and squeaking, claiming territory she'd briefly contested. She was too tired to care. She slept on the floor again, and this time her dreams were of Philadelphia, the factory, the boarding house, the streets she'd known. But when she woke in the gray dawn, she felt oddly grateful for the hardness of the floor beneath her, for the cold air on her face, for the simple fact of being somewhere else. The morning brought new problems. The stove was out, and it took her 30 minutes to restart it because she didn't understand the draft. The well pump was frozen, and she had to pour hot water over it to get it working. And when she finally made it outside to check on the cattle, she found that one of them, the sick one Hale had mentioned, was dead. Clara stood over the body, staring at it. She'd never seen a dead cow before, never seen any large animal dead. In Philadelphia, death came in smaller packages. The occasional horse collapsed in the street, dogs and cats that didn't survive the winters, the bodies of people who died in tenements and lay there until someone noticed the smell. This was different. This was big and immediate and undeniably her responsibility. She had no idea what to do with it. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn. Ethan Hale was approaching again, and Clara felt a confusing mixture of relief and embarrassment. Relief because he'd know what to do. Embarrassment because she needed him to know what to do. He dismounted and walked over without greeting, looked down at the dead cow, then looked at Clara. "How long?" "I found it this morning." "But how long since it died?" Clara shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. I don't know how to tell." Hale crouched beside the carcass, checking things Clara didn't understand. The eyes, the rigor in the legs, the smell. "Last night, probably. 4, 5 hours dead." He stood. "You need to move it away from the others. Disease spreads." "How do I move it?" He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something other than skepticism in his expression. It might have been pity, which was somehow worse. "You can't, not alone." He walked to his horse and retrieved a rope. "I'll drag it out with my horse. You'll need to burn it or bury it. Burning's faster, but you'd need fuel. Burying's slower, but the ground's soft enough if you dig deep." "I don't have a shovel." "Check the barn." He hitched the rope to his saddle horn and looped the other end around the cow's rear legs with quick, efficient movements. Then he mounted and walked his horse forward, dragging the carcass away from the water trough and toward the far corner of the property. Clara followed, feeling useless. When he'd positioned it far enough away, Hale dismounted and coiled his rope. "There's probably a shovel in the barn. If not, you'll need to buy one in town." "Mr. Hale," Clara said, and he paused. "Why are you helping me?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the valley, at the brown grass and the distant mountains and the sky that was filling with clouds that looked like trouble. "Your uncle and I weren't friends," he said finally, "but we were neighbors. Out here, that means something. He helped me once, years back when my cattle broke through the fence during a storm. Didn't ask for payment, didn't expect thanks, just helped because it needed doing." He looked at her. "I figure I owe him that much. But once that debt's paid, Miss Whitmore, you're on your own. Understood?" "Understood." He mounted and rode away, and Clara went to search the barn for a shovel. She found it eventually, buried under debris and rusted nearly through. It took her the rest of the morning and into the afternoon to dig a hole deep enough. The ground fought her. Her soft hands blistered, then bled. Her back cramped. Her shoulders burned. Several times she had to stop and lean on the shovel, gasping for air that felt too thin, wondering if Hale was right, if Mitchell was right, if everyone who'd looked at her with pity was right. But she kept digging. By the time she'd buried the cow and packed the earth down, the sun was setting. Clara walked back to the house, every muscle screaming, and collapsed into the chair at the table. Her hands were a mess of burst blisters and dirt. She should clean them, she knew. Infection out here could be deadly. Instead, she laid her head on the table and closed her eyes. A knock at the door made her jerk upright. Through the window, she saw Ethan Hale's horse, and confusion washed over her. He'd already left hours ago. She opened the door to find him holding a covered pot. "My cook made stew," he said without preamble. "She makes too much." Clara stared at the pot, then at him. "You have a cook?" "I have a ranch that works, that requires staff." He held out the pot. "Take it." She did, and the warmth of it seeped through the metal into her damaged hands. The smell that rose from it, beef, vegetables, something that might have been herbs, made her stomach clench with hunger. "Thank you," she said quietly. Hale was looking past her into the house, and she saw him taking note of what she'd accomplished. The clean room, the organized supplies, the signs of her effort. "You buried the cow," he said. "Yes." "That's hard work, especially for someone who's never done it." Clara couldn't tell if he was complimenting her or just stating fact. It needed doing. Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. "Tomorrow morning, you should come to my ranch. 6 o'clock. "Why?" "Because if you're going to kill yourself trying to run this place, you might as well learn how to do it properly first." He turned to leave, then paused. "Bring gloves. And better boots if you have them." "I don't have gloves. Or better boots." Hale sighed. "I'll find some." 6 o'clock, Miss Whitmore. Don't be late." He left before she could ask what he was planning, and Clara stood in the doorway holding the pot of stew, watching him disappear into the gathering darkness. She ate the stew standing at the stove, too hungry to bother with sitting. It was the best thing she'd tasted in weeks, maybe months. Real beef, potatoes, carrots, onions, food that someone had cared about while making. She ate until the pot was empty and her stomach ached from being too full too fast. Then she bandaged her hands with strips torn from the cleanest shirt she could find in her uncle's trunk, wrapped herself in her coat, and lay down on the floor that was becoming familiar. Tomorrow she'd start learning how to survive this place. If Ethan Hale was willing to teach her, she'd learn. If the land wanted to kill her, it would have to work harder than it had so far. She woke in the darkness, disoriented, and fumbled for the matches to light the lamp. The clock she'd found and wound showed 4:30 in the morning. She'd overslept. Or underslept. She had no idea what time ranchers were supposed to wake, but 6 o'clock was coming fast. Clara heated water for washing, used a sliver of soap to clean her face and hands, wincing at the pain in her blistered palms, and dressed in the sturdiest clothes she had. Which wasn't saying much. Her traveling dress was wool, at least, but it was designed for train compartments and hotel lobbies, not ranch work. She ate the last of the stale bread with coffee that was more bitter than warm and stepped outside into a darkness that was just beginning to gray at the edges. The cold hit her like a wall. Philadelphia had winter, but this was different. This cold was sharp and clean and utterly unforgiving. She'd never ridden a horse, didn't own a horse. The 2 miles to Hale's ranch might as well have been 20. She started walking. The road, such as it was, wound through the valley in the general direction Hale had ridden. Clara walked fast, trying to generate warmth, and watched the sky slowly lighten over the mountains. The landscape that had looked brown and dead in daylight revealed subtle colors in the dawn: silver sage, gold grass, the dark green of scattered pines. There was a harsh beauty to it that she hadn't expected. She was still a mile from Hale's ranch when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned to find him approaching on his horse, leading a second animal. He didn't look surprised to find her walking. He just rode up and stopped. "You don't have a horse," he said. "No. Can't run a ranch without a horse." "I know." He gestured to the animal he was leading, a mare, brown with a white blaze, older and calm-looking. "This is Molly. She's 20 years old, patient, and won't throw you unless you do something truly stupid. You'll use her while you're learning." Clara stared at the horse, at Hale. "I can't afford—" "She's a loan, not a gift. When you leave, she comes back." He dismounted and walked over. "Left foot in the stirrup. Grab the saddle horn, pull yourself up, and swing your right leg over." "I'm wearing a dress." "Then you'll ride poorly. Tomorrow, find pants. Your uncle probably had some." He held the stirrup steady. "Come on, Miss Whitmore. Daylight's wasting." Clara approached the horse like she was approaching a wild animal, which, for all she knew, it was. Molly turned her head to look at Clara with large, dark eyes that seemed infinitely patient and faintly amused. "Left foot in the stirrup," Hale repeated. Clara grabbed the saddle horn, put her foot in the stirrup, and tried to pull herself up. She made it approximately 6 inches before her arms gave out and she fell back. "Use your legs, not your arms. Push up." She tried again. This time she made it high enough to swing her right leg over and suddenly she was sitting on a horse 5 feet above the ground, with no idea what to do next. Reins in your left hand, gentle pressure to turn, pull back to stop, gentle pressure with your heels to go. Nothing violent. Molly knows her job. Let her do it. Hale mounted his own horse and started toward his ranch without checking to see if Clara was following. Molly, however, immediately started walking after him, and Clara grabbed the saddle horn with both hands, trying not to panic at the movement beneath her. "Sit up straight," Hale called back without turning. "Move with her, not against her. And for the love of all that's holy, stop strangling the saddle horn." Clara tried to adjust, and the horse didn't kill her, which felt like a small victory. Hale's ranch appeared as they crested a rise, and Clara felt her stomach sink. Where her property was decay and failure, his was functional and maintained. The house was sturdy, with smoke rising from the chimney. The barn was solid, with fresh paint and intact doors. The corrals were well constructed, filled with cattle that looked healthy and fed. Equipment was organized and maintained. Everything spoke of competence and control. Everything her ranch wasn't. They rode into the yard, and a man emerged from the barn, older, Mexican, with gray hair and a weathered face. He nodded to Hale and looked at Clara with open curiosity. "Diego, this is Miss Whitmore from the property south. She'll be here mornings for a while. Miss Whitmore, this is Diego Martinez. He manages my ranch while I'm pretending I can do it myself." Diego smiled at that, showing gold teeth. "Welcome, señorita. You are brave to try the Whitmore place." "Brave or foolish," Clara said. "I'm not sure which yet." "Perhaps both, no? That is often how courage works." Hale dismounted and gestured for Clara to do the same. She managed it without falling, which seemed like another small victory. "First lesson," Hale said, leading her toward the barn. "Everything starts with the animals. They eat before you eat. They're watered before you're watered. They're tended before you rest. Because if they die, you die. Understood?" "Understood." He showed her into the barn where 6 horses were stalled. Morning routine: check water buckets, dump and refill if needed. Check feed bins. Measure out grain according to each horse's needs. Check their hooves for stones or damage. Check their legs for heat or swelling. Check their eyes and nose for discharge. Any problems you note and deal with immediately. He demonstrated on his own horse, moving with practiced efficiency, explaining as he went. Clara watched, trying to memorize everything, knowing she was missing half of it. "Your turn." Clara approached Molly's stall with the same hesitation she'd felt mounting the horse. Molly nickered softly and pushed her nose toward Clara's hand. "She's saying hello," Hale said. "You can pet her. She won't bite." Clara reached out tentatively and touched the soft nose. Molly's breath was warm against her palm. "Check her water." Clara found the bucket, half empty, and looked around for where to refill it. Hale pointed toward a pump outside. She hauled the bucket out, worked the pump, easier than her own well, and carried the full bucket back. It was heavier than she expected, and water sloshed over the sides, soaking her dress. "You'll get stronger," Hale said. Not encouragement, just fact. He walked her through the entire routine 3 times, checking, feeding, watering. By the 3rd repetition, her arms were shaking and her back was screaming, but she was starting to understand the rhythm of it. "Cattle are next," Hale said, leading her toward the corrals. "Same principle. Check them every day. Look for injuries, disease, behavioral changes. You'll learn to read them like a language." He showed her how to look for signs of illness: dull eyes, labored breathing, isolation from the herd, limping, discharge. He showed her how to move among them without spooking them, how to use her body position to guide their movement, how to read their moods and reactions. Clara absorbed it all like someone drowning absorbs water, desperately, not entirely successfully, but with the knowledge that her life depended on it. "The fence," Hale said after an hour of cattle education. "Show me your worst section." They rode back to her property, Clara marginally less terrified on Molly than she'd been that morning, and she showed him the fence line where posts were leaning and rails were broken. Hale dismounted and examined it with the same careful attention he'd given everything else. "This post is rotted at the base, needs replacing. This rail split from frost. Replacement. This wire's rusted through. Dangerous. Needs complete restringing." He looked at her. "Do you know how to replace a fence post?" "No." "Do you know how to string wire?" "No." "Do you know how to use a post hole digger or hammer fence staples, or tension wire properly? No, he nodded. Then you'll learn. Tomorrow, bring tools. I'll show you once. After that, you're on your own. Mr. Hale, Clara said carefully, why are you doing this? You said you owed my uncle a debt, but this seems like more than that. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley, at the mountains beyond, at the endless sky. I told you we weren't friends, he said finally. That was true, but I respected him. He was stubborn and proud and refused help even when he needed it. Probably killed him faster. He turned to look at her. You remind me of him. Same stubborn refusal to accept reality. Same fool determination to do the impossible. The difference is, he knew what he was doing and failed anyway. You don't know what you're doing and you'll fail faster unless someone teaches you the basics. So this is charity. No. His voice was sharp. Charity would be fixing your fence for you, feeding your cattle for you, running your ranch while you play at being a rancher. This is education. What you do with it is your choice. But at least when you fail, it won't be because no one tried to help you survive. Clara felt something hot and angry rise in her chest. When I fail, not if. That's right, when. He mounted his horse. 6 o'clock tomorrow, Miss Whitmore, and find better clothes. He rode away, and Clara stood in the mud beside her broken fence, watching him go. She wanted to be angry at his certainty about her failure, wanted to use it as fuel for her determination. But part of her, the part that had spent the last 3 days discovering just how unprepared she was, wondered if he was right. Maybe she would fail. Maybe this was all impossible. Maybe she should take his offer, sell the ranch, and go back to Philadelphia with enough money to last a few months while she found another factory job, another boarding house room, another life of quiet desperation. She looked at the broken fence, at the dying cattle, at the house with the collapsed roof. Then she thought about the stew Hale had brought, the way Diego had called her brave, the feel of Molly's soft nose against her palm, the rhythm of the morning barn routine, the fact that Ethan Hale, who clearly thought she was doomed, was still willing to teach her. Maybe she would fail, but not today. She spent the rest of the day trying to apply what she'd learned. She checked her own cattle the way Hale had shown her, looking for signs of illness. She found 2 with eye discharge that might be disease or might be dust. She had no idea which and no idea how to treat it either way. She checked the water trough and found it green with algae, just as Hale had said. She dumped it, hard work that left her gasping, and refilled it with clean water from the well. The cattle drank immediately, and she felt a small surge of accomplishment. She found her uncle's trunk in the corner of the house and dug through it looking for pants. She found 3 pairs, all too large, all smelling of tobacco and work sweat. She chose the least worn pair and used her sewing skills to take in the waist and hem the legs. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. That night, she ate the last of the salt pork with beans she'd soaked all day, and the meal felt earned in a way nothing had in Philadelphia. She was asleep before full dark, and when she woke at 4:30, her body screaming protest, she forced herself up anyway. The morning routine was becoming familiar. Start the fire, heat water, dress in the altered pants, strange and liberating after years of skirts. Check the cattle. Ride Molly, who appeared at her fence line like clockwork, to Hale's ranch. He was waiting in the barn with fence posts, wire, tools, and an expression that suggested he still thought she wouldn't last the week. "This is a post hole digger," he said, holding up a tool that looked like torture device. "This is how you use it." For the next 6 hours, he taught her the brutal arithmetic of fence repair. Dig the hole, 18 inches deep, harder than it looked. Set the post, keep it plumb, keep it straight. Pack the soil, tight enough to hold, but not so tight it cracked when it dried. String the wire, tension it properly or the whole fence fails. Staple the wire, 3 staples per post angled to hold. Clara's hands, already blistered from burying the cow, developed new blisters on top of the old ones. Her shoulders burned, her back seized. She wanted to quit approximately every 15 minutes. She didn't quit. By midday, they'd replaced 4 posts on her fence line. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough. But it was something. Hale looked at the work, then at her. "You're slower than a wounded turtle, but you didn't quit. That's something. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. He wiped sweat from his face. Same time tomorrow. We'll work on reading weather. Storm's coming in 2 days. You'll need to prepare. How do you know? He pointed at the sky, at cloud formations Clara couldn't read, at wind patterns she didn't understand. The land tells you if you know how to listen. Tomorrow, I'll teach you the language. That became the pattern. Every morning at 6, Clara would ride Molly to Hale's ranch. He'd teach her something new: weather reading, cattle behavior, equipment maintenance, feed ratios, water management. Then they'd work on her property, fixing what could be fixed, noting what was beyond saving. He never did the work for her, never took the tools from her hands when she struggled, just showed her once, corrected her mistakes, and let her figure it out. It was the hardest thing Clara had ever done. Harder than the factory, harder than the poverty, harder than anything she'd imagined. Some days she moved so slowly that Hale would shake his head in disgust. Some days she made mistakes so fundamental he'd have to explain things 3 times. Some days she'd ride back to her ranch so exhausted she'd fall asleep still wearing her boots. But she was learning. She learned that cattle communicate through body language, ear position, tail movement, how they stand relative to each other. She learned that a horse's mood shows in its eyes and ears before anything else. She learned that fence posts set in rocky soil hold better than those in clay. She learned that morning cold affects equipment differently than evening cold. She learned that the sky turns a particular shade of gray before serious snow. She learned that her body could do things she'd never thought possible if she forced it hard enough. 3 weeks into this education, a storm rolled in exactly when Hale had predicted. He'd helped her prepare, moving cattle closer to shelter, securing loose equipment, boarding up the broken windows. Then he'd ridden back to his own ranch, leaving her to face it alone. The storm hit at midnight, wind that sounded like the land screaming, snow that turned the world white and erased all landmarks, cold that came through the walls like they weren't there. Clara huddled by the stove, feeding it steadily, listening to the house groan and creak around her. She thought about the cattle outside, about whether they'd survive, about whether she'd done enough to prepare them. At dawn, the storm broke. Clara forced herself into the brutal cold and waded through knee-deep snow to check the animals. 2 were missing, escaped through a fence section she hadn't reinforced properly. The rest were clustered near the barn, frost on their hides but alive. She was trying to figure out where the missing cattle had gone when Ethan Hale appeared, materializing out of the white landscape like he'd been summoned. "You lost 2, he said. Not a question. "Yes. Probably ran south toward the creek bed. We'll find them." "We?" He was already riding in that direction. "You coming or not?" They found the cattle 3 miles away, stuck in a ravine, one injured and bleeding from a gash on its leg. Hale showed Clara how to rope the injured one. She failed 6 times before succeeding, and how to guide it carefully out of the ravine without making the injury worse. By the time they got both animals back to her ranch, it was late afternoon and Clara was so cold she couldn't feel her hands. Hale showed her how to treat the wound, cleaning, examining for depth, applying a poultice he'd brought from his own supplies. "You'll need to check it twice a day for a week," he said. "If it gets infected, you'll lose the animal." Clara nodded, too tired to speak. Hale looked at her, and something in his expression was different. Softer, maybe, or just less hostile. "You should have lost more," he said quietly. "The way you secured them, the shelter you provided, it was barely adequate, but you tried, and sometimes that's enough." It was the closest thing to praise he'd ever given her. "Thank you," Clara said, "for helping me find them. Neighbors help neighbors, even stubborn fools who don't know when to quit." He mounted his horse. "Take tomorrow off. Rest. You've earned it." He rode away, and Clara stood in the snow, watching him go, feeling something warm in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. She was still going to fail, probably. The ranch was still dying. The debts were still crushing. She still barely knew what she was doing. But she'd survived a Colorado winter storm. She'd saved her cattle. She'd learned enough to be almost competent at the basics. And Ethan Hale, who'd expected her to quit in a week, was still teaching her. That had to count for something. Clara didn't take the day off. She couldn't afford to. The injured cow needed tending. The snow needed clearing from the water trough. and the fence section that had failed needed immediate repair before she lost more animals. Her body screamed for rest, but the ranch didn't care about her body's opinions. She was hammering in a new fence post when Ethan Hale rode up 3 days later. He sat his horse for a moment, watching her work, and she felt his evaluation like physical pressure. Her technique had improved. The post was plumb, the hole the right depth. But she was still slow, still inefficient. "You didn't rest," he said. Clara drove in another staple. "Couldn't." "How's the injured one?" "Healing. I've been cleaning the wound twice a day like you said. No infection yet." He dismounted and walked over to examine her fence work. He tested the post, checking for give, then nodded once. "Better. You're learning." Coming from him, it felt like a medal. "There's a ranchers' meeting in town tonight," Hale said. "You should come." Clara paused in her work. In the 6 weeks she'd been here, she'd been to town exactly twice. Once to buy supplies, once to talk to Mitchell about extending a loan payment. Both times she'd felt the weight of the town's judgment, the stares that said she didn't belong, the whispers that wondered how long until she failed. "Why would I come?" she asked. "Because you're a rancher now, whether you like it or not, and ranchers need to know what's happening in the valley." He remounted. 7 o'clock at the church. Don't be late." He rode off before she could argue, leaving Clara standing in the snow with a hammer in her blistered hands and no good reason not to go. She arrived at the church 10 minutes before 7, riding Molly through a town that looked even more desolate in the winter darkness. Light spilled from the church windows, and she could hear voices inside. Men's voices, rough and familiar with each other in the way of people who'd worked the same land for years. Clara tied Molly to the rail and stood outside for a moment, gathering courage. She was wearing her uncle's pants, a coat that didn't fit, and boots that had seen better decades. Her hair was pulled back in a braid that was more practical than pretty. She looked like what she was, a woman trying desperately to play a role she didn't understand. She opened the church door and stepped inside. The conversation stopped like someone had cut it with a knife. 20 men turned to stare at her, ranchers, ranch hands, a few business owners from town. She recognized some faces. Diego Martinez, who smiled and nodded. Mitchell, the lawyer, who looked uncomfortable. The bank manager whose name she didn't know but whose letters about her debts she'd memorized. And Ethan Hale standing near the front, his expression unreadable. "Miss Whitmore?" said a heavy man with a gray beard, the largest rancher in the valley she'd learned, named Thomas Garrett. "This is unexpected." "Mr. Hale suggested I attend," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "Did he now?" Garrett looked at Hale with something that might have been amusement. "Planning to make a habit of collecting strays, Ethan?" "I invited a neighbor to a ranchers' meeting," Hale said flatly. "Last I checked, she owns ranch land. That makes her a rancher." "Owning land and being a rancher are two different things," another man said, younger, with a sneer in his voice that Clara immediately disliked. "My money says she's gone before spring." "Then you'll lose your money," Clara said before she could stop herself. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and the room went even quieter. The young man's sneer widened. "That's so. You know how to run a ranch, do you? You know about cattle prices, feed costs, water rights, grazing rotation, breeding schedules?" "No," Clara said. "But I'm learning, and I'm not going anywhere." "We'll see about that when the bank comes calling." "Enough, Davis," Garrett said, his voice carrying authority. He looked at Clara with eyes that were shrewd and assessing. "You're welcome to stay, Miss Whitmore. Take a seat in the back." It was a dismissal disguised as invitation, but Clara took it. She found a chair near the wall and sat, aware of every eye on her, every whisper she couldn't quite hear. The meeting resumed. They discussed cattle prices, down again this year, water rights. There was a dispute between two ranchers over creek access. The railroad, still no plans to extend the line through the valley, which meant higher costs to get cattle to market. The spring roundup, they needed to coordinate to make it efficient. Clara listened and understood perhaps half of what was said. The other half was a language she hadn't learned yet, full of terms and references that assumed knowledge she didn't have. But she listened anyway, memorizing what she could, noting questions to ask Hale later. Near the end of the meeting, Garrett brought up a topic that made the whole room tense. "Some of you have noticed increased rustling this winter. I've lost 6 head in the last month. Patterson lost 4. The tracks suggest it's organized, not just opportunistic theft. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. We need to increase patrols, someone said. Watch the herds at night. That requires manpower most of us don't have, another voice countered. Then we pool resources, take turns, cover each other's land. And who decides the rotation? Who makes sure everyone pulls their weight? The argument grew heated, voices overlapping, tensions rising. Clara watched it unfold and understood that this was about more than stolen cattle. This was about a valley slowly dying, about men watching their livelihood slip away, about fear disguised as anger. What about the Whitmore Ranch? Davis said suddenly, his voice cutting through the argument. She gonna take patrol shifts? The room went quiet again. Everyone turned to look at Clara. I can't, she said simply. I don't have enough people. I barely have enough time to manage what I'm already doing. Then maybe you shouldn't be here, Davis said. This is about ranchers helping ranchers. If you can't contribute, you don't get a say. Clara felt heat rise in her face. I didn't ask for a say. I came because I was invited. And if you want me to leave, just say so. Nobody's asking you to leave them, Garrett said, shooting Davis a warning look. But he's right about one thing. This valley survives because we work together. If you can't contribute to the common good, that's a problem. I'll take her patrol shifts, Hale said. Every head swiveled toward him. You'll what? Garrett asked. I'll cover her portion of the patrol rotation. I'm already riding my own land at night. I can extend the route to include hers. Hale's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing fence posts rather than adding hours of dangerous night work to his schedule. That's not fair to you, Davis protested. I didn't ask your opinion on what's fair to me. Why would you do that? Garrett asked, his shrewd eyes moving between Hale and Clara. Because she's a neighbor. Because her uncle was a decent man. Because I feel like it. Hale's tone made it clear the subject was closed. Are we done here? The meeting broke up shortly after, men filing out into the cold night, their conversations resuming in clusters. Clara waited until most had left, then approached Hale near the door. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I know. I don't need you to fight my battles. Wasn't fighting your battle. Was shutting down Davis before he derailed the whole meeting. He likes the sound of his own voice too much. Hale pulled on his gloves. And I was already planning to ride your land anyway. Rustlers don't respect property lines. Still, thank you. He nodded, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. You handled yourself well in there, better than I expected. You expected me to cry and run out? Something like that. The corner of his mouth might have twitched, might have. You going to be at my place tomorrow morning? 6 o'clock, same as always. Good. We need to work on your roping. It's still terrible. He walked out into the night, leaving Clara standing in the empty church, feeling oddly warm despite the cold. The next morning brought clouds that Hale said meant snow within 48 hours. He worked Clara harder than usual, as if trying to cram extra knowledge into her before the weather turned bad. They practiced roping until her arm felt like it might fall off, then moved to reading cattle behavior, then to emergency winter procedures. If a storm comes and you lose cattle in the dark, Hale said, you don't go after them alone. You wait for daylight or you wait for help. Dying for a cow is stupid. You came after me in the last storm, Clara pointed out. That was different. You're a person. They're cattle. You value me more than cattle? I'm touched. He gave her a look that might have been exasperation or might have been something else. Don't make me regret it. The snow started that night just as he'd predicted. Clara watched it from her window, feeding the stove steadily, listening to the wind build. This storm felt different from the last one, angrier, more violent. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked. The snow didn't fall, it drove horizontally, turning the world into a white chaos. By midnight, Clara was genuinely worried. She checked the cattle as best she could from the house. They were clustered near the barn, using it as a windbreak, but she couldn't see much through the driving snow. At 1 a.m, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Cattle bellowing. Not the normal low calls, but panicked, distressed sounds. Claire grabbed her coat and forced open the door against the wind. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. The snow was knee-deep and still falling. Visibility was perhaps 10 feet. She fought her way to the barn and found catastrophe. A section of the barn wall had collapsed under the weight of snow and wind. The cattle, spooked by the noise and the sudden opening, had scattered. She could hear them in the darkness, their calls coming from different directions, moving away from the safety of the barn. Clara stood there for a frozen moment, her mind racing. Hale's voice echoed in her memory. Don't go after them alone. Wait for help. Dying for a cow is stupid. But if she waited for daylight, they'd be scattered across miles of snow-covered valley. She'd lose them all. And she couldn't afford to lose them all. Those cattle were everything, the only asset the ranch had, the only thing standing between her and complete failure. She made the decision without really thinking about it. Clara went back to the house, grabbed a rope and the lantern, and headed into the storm. The world dissolved into white chaos the moment she left the barn's shelter. The wind tore at her coat, drove snow into her eyes, made every breath a struggle. The lantern helped, barely, creating a small bubble of visibility in the overwhelming dark. She could hear cattle ahead, their calls, their movement. She followed the sounds, struggling through snow that kept getting deeper, feeling the cold work its way through her coat and into her bones. She found the first cow 50 yards from the barn, standing confused in a drift. Clara approached slowly, talking to it the way Hale had taught her, keeping her voice calm, even though her heart was hammering. She got the rope around its neck and started leading it back toward the barn. Except she couldn't find the barn. In the white darkness, with no landmarks visible, Clara had lost her bearings completely. She turned in what she thought was the right direction and saw nothing but snow. Turned another direction. Still nothing. The panic that rose in her throat was cold and sharp. The cow bellowed and tried to pull away. Clara held tight to the rope, her hands already numb inside her gloves. She picked a direction and started walking, praying it was right, knowing that if it wasn't, she was going to die out here. She walked for what felt like hours but was probably minutes. Her legs were shaking from cold and effort. Her lungs burned. The cow fought her every step. She was starting to think she'd made a terrible mistake, that Hale was right. This was stupid. She was going to die for an animal that wasn't worth her life, when she saw a darker shape in the white chaos. The barn. She'd somehow found the barn. Clara got the cow inside and secured it, then leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, her whole body shaking. She should stop, should stay inside where it was marginally safer, should wait for daylight like Hale had said, but she could still hear cattle calling in the darkness. She went back out. The second cow was farther away, harder to catch. The third was injured, limping badly, and fought her attempts to rope it. The fourth had made it almost to the creek, a quarter-mile from the barn, and Clara nearly lost it in a ravine. By the time she was searching for the fifth, Clara was barely functioning. The cold had moved beyond pain into something worse, a numbness that made her fingers useless, made her thoughts slow and confused. She found the cow near the collapsed fence line, got the rope on it, started back, and realized she was lost again. Clara turned in a circle, the cow pulling against the rope, the storm screaming around her. She couldn't see the barn, couldn't see anything. The lantern had gone out somewhere along the way. She was standing in absolute darkness, with only the feel of snow and wind to tell her she was still alive. This was how she was going to die. Not in Philadelphia, not in a factory, not in a boarding house. Here. In a Colorado storm, chasing cattle she barely knew how to handle, on land that had never wanted her. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt oddly calm. If she was going to die, at least it would be trying. At least it would be her choice. Then she heard hoofbeats. A shape materialized from the white darkness, a horse and rider, moving with impossible certainty through the storm. Ethan Hale pulled up beside her, and even in the darkness she could see the fury in his expression. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted over the wind. "Saving my cattle! You're killing yourself! They're my cattle!" He swung down from his horse and grabbed her arm. His grip was iron hard even through the coat. "The barn is 200 yards that direction. Can you make it?" Clara's teeth were chattering too hard to answer. She just nodded. "Then move. I'll get the cow." He took the rope from her numb hands and boosted her onto his horse. Then he started walking, leading both the horse and the cow through the storm with a sureness that came from years of reading this land in all conditions. They found the barn. Hale got the cow inside, then turned to Clara. How many more? I don't know. 3? 4? I lost count. His jaw clenched. Stay here. I'm coming with you. Like hell you are. They're my cattle, Clara shouted. My ranch. My responsibility. And you're half frozen and completely lost. You'll die out there. Then I'll die trying. They stood there in the doorway of the barn, wind howling around them, snow driving in, staring at each other. Clara saw the anger in his face, but she also saw something else. Fear. He was afraid for her. Please, he said, and his voice was quieter. Stay here. Let me do this. I can't. Why not? Because if she let him save her cattle while she hid in the barn, she'd be proving everyone right. Davis, Mitchell, Garrett, the whole town. She'd be proving she couldn't do this, couldn't survive, couldn't be a rancher. She'd be admitting defeat. Because I have to prove I belong here, she said. Hale was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You've already proved that. Not to myself. He studied her face, and something in his expression changed, softened. Then we go together. You stay close to me. You do exactly what I say. And if I tell you to get on the horse and ride back, you do it. Agreed? Agreed. They went back into the storm. With Hale leading, the search was faster and more efficient. He seemed to know exactly where to look, reading signs Clara couldn't see. Tracks already filling with snow, the sound patterns of cattle calls, the way the wind moved around terrain features. They found 2 more cows together, working as a team. Clara would keep hold of one while Hale roped another. Then they'd herd both back to the barn. The last cow was the hardest. It had made it nearly half a mile from the ranch, driven by panic into rough country. They found it stuck in a gully, exhausted and barely moving. It's not going to make it, Hale said, examining the animal. We should leave it. No. Clara, it's done. Even if we get it out, it won't survive. We're not leaving it. He looked at her, then at the cow, then back at her. You're as stubborn as your uncle was. Good. Together they worked the cow out of the gully. It took 20 minutes of brutal effort, pushing, pulling, coaxing, forcing. By the time they got it free and started back toward the barn, both Clara and Hale were soaked with sweat despite the cold, gasping for air that burned their lungs. They made it back to the barn as the first gray light of dawn was breaking through the storm. Hale got the last cow inside, then collapsed against the wall, breathing hard. Clara slid down next to him, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and cold. That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen, Hale said. Did we get them all? Yes. Then it wasn't stupid. He turned to look at her, and in the growing light she could see his face clearly. He looked exhausted, soaked, and furious. He also looked like he might be fighting back a smile. You could have died out there. So could you. I know what I'm doing, and I'm learning. Clara met his eyes. You said ranchers help ranchers. You came out in this storm to help me. Why is it stupid when I do the same for my cattle? Because cattle are replaceable. You're not. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Clara was almost afraid to examine. I'm not special, she said quietly. I'm just someone who inherited a dying ranch and is too stubborn to quit. That's what makes you special, Hale said. He stood and offered her his hand. Come on, we need to get you warm before you freeze to death after surviving all that. Clara took his hand, his grip was warm and strong despite the cold, and let him pull her to her feet. They walked to the house together, and Hale built up her fire while she changed into dry clothes behind a blanket she'd hung for privacy. When she emerged, he had coffee heating on the stove. I don't have real coffee, she admitted. Just the chicory blend. It's warm. That's enough. They sat at her table, drinking terrible coffee, listening to the storm gradually weaken outside. The gray light grew stronger. The wind eased. The snow slowed to flurries. You saved them, Hale said finally. All of them. That's remarkable. We saved them. No. I helped. You saved them. You made the choice to go out there. You refused to give up even when you should have. He took another sip of the awful coffee. Your uncle would have done the same thing, would have been just as stupid about it too. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. He set down his cup. Clara, I need to tell you something. The use of her first name made her look up sharply. He'd never used it before. Always Miss Whitmore, always formal, always distant. When you first came here, he continued, I gave you a week, maybe 2 if you were stubborn. I was certain you'd fail, certain the land would break you the way it's broken everyone else who tried. He met her eyes. I was wrong. I haven't succeeded yet. The ranch is still dying. I'm still in debt. I still barely know what I'm doing. But you're still here, still fighting, still refusing to quit even when quitting would be the smart choice. He leaned forward slightly. Do you know what that means? That I'm a fool? That you belong here. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee or the stove. The land hasn't accepted me, she said. The town still thinks I'll fail. The bank is still counting down to foreclosure. The town doesn't matter. The bank doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can look at this place and see home instead of burden. Hale stood. I need to get back to my own ranch. But Clara, what you did tonight, that wasn't just saving cattle. That was proving you're willing to risk everything for this land. That's what ranchers do. That's who we are. He walked to the door, then paused. The spring roundup is in 6 weeks. If you can make it through that, if you can prove your cattle are healthy enough to sell, you might have a chance to pay down some of that debt. It's your last chance, really. You understand that? I understand. Then we'll work double time, every morning, every evening if necessary. I'll teach you everything I can, but the rest is up to you. Thank you, Ethan. He nodded once and walked out into the dying storm, leaving Clara alone in her house with her coffee and her exhaustion and a feeling in her chest that might have been hope. She walked to the window and watched him ride away across the white landscape. The sun was breaking through the clouds now, turning the snow from gray to gold. The valley, so harsh and deadly in the night, looked almost beautiful in the morning light. Clara looked at her hands, blistered, calloused, strong in ways they'd never been in Philadelphia. She thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 6 weeks ago, terrified and unprepared and certain she'd made a terrible mistake. That woman was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who could read weather and tend cattle and survive storms that should have killed her. Someone who belonged to this land in a way she'd never belonged anywhere. The ranch was still dying. The debts were still crushing. The spring roundup was still an impossible test she might not pass. But she was still here, and she wasn't planning to leave. The 6 weeks before the spring roundup became a blur of relentless work and desperate learning. Ethan was true to his word, every morning at 6, every evening at 5, pushing Clara harder than she'd ever been pushed. Her body adapted in ways that would have seemed impossible in Philadelphia. Muscles developed where she'd never had them. Her hands, once soft from sewing, became leather hard. The blisters that had plagued her those first weeks turned to calluses that let her work without pain. But physical strength wasn't enough. Ethan drilled her on cattle handling until she could read a herd's mood from 50 yards. He taught her the subtle art of horse communication, not just riding, but understanding, becoming part of the animal rather than a burden on its back. He showed her how to throw a rope with accuracy, how to work gates single-handed, how to move cattle through terrain without exhausting them. The roundup isn't just gathering cattle, he told her one evening as they worked her fence line. It's proving you can manage them. Every rancher in the valley will be watching. They'll see how your cattle respond to you, how healthy they are, how well you've prepared them. They'll judge you on that. They've already judged me, Claire said, hammering in a fence staple. They've made assumptions. Now you get to prove them wrong or right. He tested the wire tension. Your cattle are in better shape than they were 2 months ago, but they're still thin. We need to put weight on them before the roundup. With what feed? I've already used everything I can afford. Ethan was quiet for a moment, that particular silence that meant he was making a decision he didn't want to make. I've got extra hay. You can use it. I can't pay you. I know. Ethan, I can't keep taking from you. You've already given me more than... It's not charity, he interrupted. It's investment. If your cattle fail at the roundup, the bank forecloses, and this land sits empty. Empty land means problems for everyone. Squatters, rustlers, neglected fence lines that let livestock wander. It's in my interest to help you succeed. Claire studied his face and saw the lie beneath the logic. He was helping because he wanted to help, Because somewhere in the last 2 months, she'd stopped being an annoying obligation and become something else. What exactly, she wasn't sure, but something. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and went back to work. And Clara felt that warmth in her chest again, the one that showed up more and more frequently when he was around. The additional feed made a visible difference. Over the next 3 weeks, her cattle began to fill out. Their ribs stopped showing quite so prominently. Their coats improved. They moved with more energy, more life. It wasn't dramatic. They were still lean compared to Ethan's well-fed herd, but it was enough to give Clara hope. She needed that hope because the bank sent another letter. Mitchell delivered it personally, riding out to her ranch on a gray morning when the clouds promised rain. "I tried to buy you more time," he said, standing awkwardly in her doorway. "But the bank is firm. If you can't make a significant payment after the roundup, they'll begin foreclosure proceedings." "How significant?" "At least half of what you owe, which is—" He pulled out a paper and showed her the number. Clara felt her stomach drop. It was more than she could possibly make even if every single cow sold for premium price, which they wouldn't because they weren't premium cattle. "That's impossible," she said. "I know." Mitchell looked genuinely sympathetic. "Miss Whitmore, I admire what you've tried to do here, truly. But perhaps it's time to accept reality. You could sell the ranch to Hale, pay off the debts, and walk away with enough money to start fresh somewhere else." "Start fresh doing what?" "I was a seamstress in Philadelphia, Mitchell. I made $7 a week and lived in a room with 3 other women. That's not a life, that's survival." "And this isn't?" He gestured at the ranch, still shabby, still struggling, still half-broken despite her efforts. "This is different. Here, I'm building something, or trying to. In Philadelphia, I was just existing." Clara folded the letter carefully. "I'll find a way to make the payment." "How?" "I don't know yet, but I will." Mitchell shook his head but didn't argue further. After he left, Clara sat at her table and stared at the number on the paper. It was impossible. Even she could see that, but she'd survived impossible before. She'd survived that first night in the house, the winter storms, the learning curve that should have killed her, the midnight rescue of cattle that everyone said she should have abandoned. If she could survive all that, maybe she could survive this too. That evening, when Ethan arrived for their usual training session, Clara showed him the letter. He read it in silence, his face unreadable. "This is what I feared," he said finally. "Can I make it? If everything goes perfectly at the roundup?" He was quiet for too long. "No." The single word hit like a physical blow. "Even if every cow sells well, you're still short." He handed back the letter. "I'm sorry, Clara." She took the paper with numb fingers. "So that's it. I fail." "You haven't failed. You've done more with this place in 3 months than most could do in a year." But the arithmetic doesn't care about effort. Clara felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She'd known, of course. Known from the beginning that the odds were impossible. But she'd hoped anyway. Hoped that hard work and determination and refusing to quit would somehow be enough. They weren't. "I should sell to you," she said dully. "Take whatever I can get and leave before the bank takes everything." "You should." "But I don't want to." Ethan moved closer, and his voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "I know, but wanting isn't enough, not against numbers like these." Clara looked out the window at the ranch, her ranch, though not for much longer. The cattle were grazing peacefully. The fences she'd repaired stood straight. The barn, while still shabby, was functional. The house was clean and organized and felt impossibly like home. "I'm not ready to give up," she said. "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "There might be one option. It's a risk, probably stupid, but it's something." Clara turned to face him. "Tell me." "The railroad is expanding. Not through here, we lost that bid, but there's a new line going through 30 miles north. They need beef to feed the construction crews. They're paying premium prices for immediate delivery." "How premium?" 50% over market rate. Maybe more if the cattle are good quality." Clara's mind raced. "If I could sell directly to them instead of going through the normal markets, you'd make enough to cover the bank payment, maybe even a little extra." Ethan held up a hand. "But it's not that simple. They need delivery in 3 weeks, which means you'd miss the Valley Roundup entirely. You'd have to drive your cattle 30 miles over rough country by yourself, and you'd need someone to vouch for you, to introduce you to the railroad buyers, or they won't take you seriously. Would you vouch for me? I would, but I can't help you drive the cattle. The Valley Roundup is the same week, and I've got my own herd to manage. Clara absorbed this, understanding the full picture now. She'd be completely alone, driving 30 head of cattle through mountain country she didn't know, navigating rivers, steep trails, predators, weather. Any one of a dozen things could go wrong. She could lose cattle, could lose her way, could lose everything. But if it worked, she'd save the ranch. I'll do it, she said. Clara, I need you to understand the risks. You've never driven cattle that distance. The terrain is brutal. You'd be alone for 3 days, maybe 4. If you run into trouble, there's no one to help. I understand. Do you? Because if you fail, if you lose the cattle or can't find the railroad camp or the buyers reject your herd, that's it. The bank forecloses, you lose everything, and you might lose your life in the process. I understand, Claire repeated. But what choice do I have? I can sell to you now and walk away with nothing, or I can try this and maybe save the ranch. Those are my options. Ethan studied her for a long moment. When did you get so stubborn? I inherited it from my uncle, apparently. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Then we have 2 weeks to prepare you. And Clara, this is going to make everything we've done so far look easy. You need to be able to drive cattle alone, navigate by landmarks, handle river crossings, deal with predators, and do it all while keeping your herd calm and together. That's a skill set most ranchers take years to develop. Then you'd better start teaching me. Those 2 weeks were brutal. Ethan pushed her harder than ever, simulating every possible scenario she might face on the drive. They practiced moving cattle through tight spaces, across water, up steep inclines. He taught her navigation, making her memorize landmarks and estimate distances. He drilled her on predator recognition and deterrence. He showed her how to make a cold camp when fire was too dangerous, how to sleep in shifts with one eye on the herd, how to handle a panicked stampede. You can't stop a stampede, he told her. You can only guide it. Turn it into a circle and let it exhaust itself. Try to stop it head on and you'll be killed. They practiced at night because that's when problems would happen. Clara learned to read the cattle's moods in darkness, to hear the subtle sounds that meant trouble was building. She learned to stay awake through exhaustion, to push past pain, to make decisions when fear was screaming at her to run. Diego joined some of the training sessions, offering advice born from years of cattle drives in Mexico. The cattle, they will test you, señorita. Every day they will test. You must be firm but not cruel, strong but not harsh. They must respect you or they will not follow. How do I make them respect me? Diego smiled. That you have already done. They eat because of you. They have water because of you. They survive the winter because of you. They know this, even if they do not think it like we think. You are their leader now. You must believe it. Clara worked on believing it. Some days were easier than others. Some days she felt like she was starting to understand this life, starting to become the person she needed to be. Other days she felt like she was play acting, pretending to be a rancher, fooling no one including herself. But she kept working. The valley noticed her preparations. Word spread that she was attempting the railroad drive, and the reaction was mixed. Some ranchers thought she was brave. Most thought she was insane. Davis made sure everyone heard his opinion that she'd lose every cow and probably die in the process. Let her try, Garrett said when the topic came up at the general store. Clara was there buying supplies for the drive and overheard the conversation. Either she succeeds and we all benefit from having a functioning ranch in the valley, or she fails and we stop wasting time on lost causes. It wasn't quite a vote of confidence, but Clara would take it. 3 days before the planned departure, Ethan rode to her ranch with a pack horse loaded with supplies. Food for 5 days, medical kit for you and the cattle, extra rope, ammunition for your rifle. You do have a rifle? I found my uncle's in the barn. I don't know how to shoot it. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, as if praying for patience. Get it. He spent the next 2 hours teaching her to load, aim, and fire the old Winchester. Clara's first shot nearly knocked her over from the recoil. Her second went wide of the target by 5 feet. By the 20th shot, she was hitting what she aimed at more often than not. It's not great, Ethan admitted, but it's better than nothing. Remember, the gun is for predators and emergencies, not for showing off. I wasn't planning to show off. Good. He loaded the last of the supplies onto her horse. The route I've marked on this map should take you 3 days if the weather holds. There are 3 river crossings, 2 easy, 1 difficult. I've noted the locations. Stay on the high trails where you can. They're harder on the cattle, but safer from predators. Clara studied the map, memorizing every detail. 3 days alone with 30 head of cattle. 3 days to save everything or lose everything. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Good. Fear keeps you alert. It's overconfidence that kills. Ethan met her eyes. But you can do this, Clara. You've survived everything this valley has thrown at you. You're stronger than you think. I hope you're right. I'm always right. It's annoying, I know. Clara laughed despite her fear, and some of the tension eased. The night before departure, she couldn't sleep. She lay on her bedroll. She'd graduated from sleeping on the floor to an actual bedroll, which felt like luxury, and listened to the familiar sounds of the ranch at night. The cattle settling, the wind through the broken barn boards, the creak of the house adjusting to the cooling temperature. This was home now. Somehow, impossibly, the struggling ranch in the middle of nowhere had become the place she belonged. The thought of losing it felt like losing a part of herself. She rose before dawn, dressed in her warmest clothes, and prepared for departure. The cattle sensed something different. They were restless, moving more than usual. Clara moved among them, speaking softly, letting them adjust to the fact that something was about to change. Ethan arrived as the sun broke over the mountains. He helped her make final preparations, checking her supplies, ensuring her horse was properly loaded. Remember everything I taught you, he said. Trust your instincts. Trust the cattle. And if something goes wrong, if you lose the herd or can't make it, turn back. The ranch isn't worth your life. Yes, it is, Clara said quietly. Ethan looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Not to me. Before she could respond, he stepped back. Good luck, Clara. I'll see you in 4 days. 5, she corrected. 4 days of driving, 1 day to negotiate and finalize the sale. 5, then. He mounted his horse and rode away, but he turned back once to look at her, and Clara felt that warmth in her chest burn brighter. Then she turned to her cattle and took a deep breath. All right, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Let's go earn our place. The first day was harder than she'd imagined, but easier than she'd feared. The cattle, used to her now, moved relatively well. They tested her occasionally. A few would try to break away, to return to familiar territory. But Clara had learned how to anticipate and counter these moves. She circled them back, kept the herd together, maintained a steady pace that covered ground without exhausting the animals. The terrain was rough but manageable. The weather held clear and cold. By nightfall, Clara had covered almost 10 miles and felt a cautious optimism building. She made camp in a small valley Ethan had marked on the map, building a fire just large enough for coffee and warmth. The cattle settled nearby, exhausted from the day's travel. Clara sat with her rifle across her lap, watching the darkness, listening for sounds that meant trouble. Sometime after midnight, she heard howls in the distance. Wolves. The cattle heard them too and became restless, moving nervously, calling to each other. Clara stood, grabbed a burning branch from her fire, and walked the perimeter of the herd, making herself visible, making noise, letting any predators know she was there and armed. The howls faded. The cattle settled. Clara returned to her fire and sat back down, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. This was what the next 3 days would be like. Constant vigilance, constant readiness, no rest, no help. Just her and the land and the cattle and the mission. She could do this. She had to. The second day brought the first river crossing. Ethan had marked it as one of the easy ones, but easy was relative. The water was moving fast with snowmelt, and the cattle balked at the edge, refusing to enter. Clara tried everything she'd learned. She pushed them, coaxed them, tried to lead by example, riding Molly into the water to show it was safe. The cattle just stood at the bank, stubborn and immovable. Finally, Clara remembered something Diego had said. The cattle will follow if they trust you. They must see you as their leader. She dismounted, stood at the edge of the water, and raised her voice. Not shouting, not angry, but firm and commanding in a way she'd never used before. "Move, now!" And incredibly, they did. The herd entered the water following her voice, trusting her certainty even when they didn't trust the river. Clara stayed on the bank, guiding them across, counting heads as they emerged on the far side. 29, 30. All accounted for. She remounted Molly and crossed herself, the cold water reaching her thighs, soaking through her clothes. But she was grinning despite the cold, despite the discomfort, because she'd done it. She'd driven cattle across a river alone. The second river crossing late that afternoon was equally successful. By nightfall of the second day, Clara had covered another 11 miles and was starting to believe she might actually succeed. The third day brought disaster. She woke to gray skies and a wind that smelled like snow. The cattle were agitated, sensing the coming weather. Clara broke camp quickly and pushed them hard, trying to cover as much ground as possible before the storm hit. She was 5 miles from the railroad camp when the snow started. Not the gentle flakes of a light snowfall, but the driving, blinding snow of a serious storm. The temperature dropped. Visibility vanished. The cattle panicked. Clara tried to keep them together, tried to maintain control, but the combination of snow and fear was too much. The herd scattered, cattle running in different directions, their calls lost in the wind. For a moment, Clara felt panic rise in her throat. This was it. This was how she'd lose everything. Not to lack of skill or bad luck, but to weather she couldn't control. Then she remembered Ethan's voice. "You can't stop a stampede. Guide it. Turn it into a circle." Clara spurred Molly forward, circling wide around the running cattle, pushing them from the outside, gradually bending their run into a curve. It was dangerous. If Molly slipped, if Clara fell, she'd be trampled. But she kept pushing, kept guiding, and slowly, impossibly, the cattle's run curved back on itself. They ran in a circle for what felt like an eternity, gradually slowing, gradually exhausting themselves, until finally they stopped, huddled together, heaving and scared but contained. Clara sat on Molly, gasping for breath, and did a count. 28. She was missing 2. She couldn't search in this storm, couldn't leave the main herd to look for strays. She had to make a choice, stay with the 28 she had, or risk losing everything searching for 2. It was the hardest decision she'd ever made, but Clara knew what she had to do. The 28 were her priority. She'd save what she could save. She pushed the herd forward through the storm, navigating by instinct and memory more than visibility. And 4 hours later, exhausted, frozen, nearly broken, she saw the glow of lights through the snow. The railroad camp. She'd made it. The camp foreman, a man named Carson, helped her get the cattle into a temporary corral. Then he brought her into a warm mess tent and handed her coffee that actually tasted like coffee. "You drove these cattle alone?" he asked, studying her with a mixture of disbelief and respect. "Yes, sir." "Through that storm?" "I didn't have much choice. The storm hit while I was en route." Carson whistled low. "That's some determination. Let me look at your herd tomorrow when this weather clears. If they're healthy, we'll talk price." Clara wrapped her hands around the hot coffee and allowed herself a moment to feel relief. She'd made it. Against all odds, through impossible conditions, she'd made it. Now she just had to hope 28 cattle would be enough. Clara spent that night in a spare bunk in the workers' quarters, but sleep came in fragments. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those 2 missing cattle running into the white storm, lost somewhere in the mountains. She'd made the right choice, the only choice, but it still felt like failure. 28 cattle might not be enough. The arithmetic that had haunted her for months was still there, still unforgiving, and now she was 2 heads short of her already impossible goal. Dawn came gray and cold. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried under fresh snow that made everything look clean and new. Clara dressed quickly and went to check on her cattle in the corral. They looked exhausted but alive, their breath misting in the cold air. She counted them again, hoping somehow she'd miscounted in the chaos of the storm. 28. Still 28. Carson found her there, studying the herd with a critical eye that spoke of decades evaluating livestock. He walked among them slowly, checking their condition, their temperament, their overall health. Clara stood silent, letting her work speak for itself. These cattle weren't as robust as Ethan's, weren't as well fed as they should have been, But they were alive and functional because she'd kept them that way through a winter that had tried hard to kill them. "They're lean," Carson said finally, "but they're sound. No disease I can see. Good temperament." He turned to look at Clara. "How'd you end up ranching alone?" "I inherited the property from my uncle. He died 3 months ago." "And before that?" "Before that I was a seamstress in Philadelphia." Carson's eyebrows rose. "A seamstress? And now you're driving cattle through mountain storms alone. That's quite a change." "I didn't have much choice." "There's always a choice. You could have sold out, gone back east." He leaned against the corral fence. "But you didn't. Why?" Clara thought about how to answer that. Because she was stubborn? Because she had nothing to go back to? Because somewhere in the last 3 months she'd stopped running from things and started running towards something? "Because it's mine," she said finally. "The ranch, the land, the struggle, it's all mine. For the first time in my life, I own something that matters. I'm building something, and I'm not ready to let it go." Carson nodded slowly. "I can respect that. All right, Miss Whitmore, I'll give you premium rate for the lot, 50% over market." Clara did the math in her head, and her heart sank. Even at that rate, 28 head wouldn't cover the bank payment. She'd be short. Not by much, maybe $100. But in debt collection, close didn't count. "Is something wrong?" Carson asked, noting her expression. "No, sir. That's a fair price. More than fair." Clara forced herself to smile. "When can we finalize the sale?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll have the paymaster draw up the paperwork." He started to walk away, then paused. "You know, we're going to need regular beef deliveries for the next 6 months while this line gets built. If you can provide quality cattle on schedule, I'd be willing to set up a contract. Premium rates for guaranteed delivery." Clara's breath caught. "How regular?" "Once a month? 20 to 30 head each time, depending on what you can spare." He studied her face. "That is, if you can manage it. It's a hard drive. Not everyone could do what you just did." "I can manage it," Clara said, her voice steady despite the hope flaring in her chest. "A contract, regular income, not just survival but actual sustainability." "I can absolutely manage it." "Then we'll discuss terms tomorrow." Carson tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Clara standing in the snow, trying to process what had just happened. She'd done it. Not perfectly. She'd lost 2 cattle, arrived half frozen, nearly died in the storm, but she'd done it, and now she had a future. A real future, not just a desperate scramble to make one more payment. But first, she still had to make that payment, and she was still short. Clara spent the rest of the day helping with camp tasks. She wasn't going to sit idle when there was work to be done, and trying not to obsess over the numbers in her head. $100 short, that was all. Just $100 between her and losing everything. That evening, as she was preparing to settle into her bunk for the night, one of the camp workers found her. "Miss Whitmore? There's someone here asking for you." Clara's heart jumped. Had something happened at the ranch? Had the bank moved faster than expected? She followed the worker outside and found Ethan Hale standing in the camp yard covered in snow, his horse steaming from hard riding. "Ethan?" Clara hurried toward him. "What are you doing here? Is something wrong?" He dismounted, and she saw exhaustion in every line of his face. "I brought something for you." He walked to his horse and untied something from the saddle. 2 cows, the 2 she'd lost in the storm. Clara stared at them, then at Ethan, unable to process what she was seeing. "How did you—" "I followed your trail day before yesterday. Wanted to make sure you made it through that first river crossing safely." He rubbed his face tiredly. "When the storm hit, I pushed hard to catch up, thinking you might need help. Found your main herd's tracks heading this direction and 2 sets of tracks going the other way. Tracked them down yesterday, brought them in today." "You tracked them through the mountains? In that storm?" "After the storm, mostly. Tracking during the storm would have been suicide." He managed a tired smile. "I'm not that stupid." Clara felt something tight and painful in her chest. "You didn't have to do this. You had your own roundup to manage." "Diego can handle the roundup. He's been running cattle longer than I've been alive." Ethan looked at her, and his expression was softer than she'd ever seen it. "Besides, I figured you could use these. Unless you don't want them." Don't want them? Ethan, these make the difference between making my payment and losing the ranch. Of course I want them. Her voice broke slightly. Why would you do this for me? He was quiet for a long moment, and the camp's sounds, workers talking, equipment moving, the general chaos of a railroad construction site, faded into background noise. Because when you rode out into that storm to save your cattle, Ethan said finally, I realized something. I'd been telling myself I was helping you out of obligation, debt to your uncle, neighborly duty, all these practical reasons that let me pretend I was being logical. He stepped closer. But that was a lie. I've been helping you because somewhere in the last 3 months, watching you refuse to quit, watching you break yourself trying to learn, watching you become someone who belongs to this land, I stopped seeing you as a burden and started seeing you as someone I didn't want to lose. Clara's breath caught. Ethan, you don't have to say anything. I know this isn't the time or the place, but when I thought about you driving those cattle alone, thought about all the things that could go wrong, thought about maybe never seeing you again. He shook his head. I couldn't let that happen, so I followed. And when I found these two wandering in the mountains, I brought them in, because you need them, and because I need you to succeed. The words hung in the cold air between them, honest and raw and terrifying in their vulnerability. Clara had spent 3 months learning a new language, the language of cattle and land and weather, but this was different. This was the language of something she'd stopped believing in after Philadelphia, after the man who'd stolen her savings and disappeared, after all the small betrayals that had taught her not to trust. But this was Ethan, who'd taught her everything, who'd pushed her when she needed pushing and caught her when she was falling, who'd given her hay and supplies and knowledge and patience, and now, impossibly, 2 rescued cattle that meant the difference between survival and failure. I need to tell you something too, Clara said quietly. When I first came here, I was running away. From Philadelphia, from poverty, from a life that was killing me slowly. I didn't choose this place. It was just the only option I had left. She met his eyes, but somewhere along the way, it stopped being about running away and started being about running toward this land, toward this life, toward, she paused, gathering courage, toward you. Ethan's expression shifted, something fierce and warm lighting in his eyes. Clara, let me finish. You've given me everything these last 3 months, not just knowledge or supplies. You've given me a chance to become someone I didn't know I could be, someone strong, someone capable, someone who belongs. Her voice strengthened. And yes, I need to succeed at this ranch, but not just because of the debt or the bank or proving the town wrong. I need to succeed because this place, this valley, this life, this future I'm building, it's the first thing that's ever been truly mine. And I want to keep it. I want to keep all of it. The last words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and from the way Ethan's face changed, Clara knew he understood. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides and kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was fierce and certain and tasted like cold air and hope and 3 months of something building between them that neither had been willing to name. When they broke apart, Clara was breathless and dizzy and grinning like an idiot. Well, Ethan said, and his voice was rougher than usual. That's one way to seal a partnership. Partnership? If you think I'm letting you drive cattle to this camp once a month alone, you're more stubborn than I thought. We'll do it together. Combine our herds, make the drive more efficient, split the profits. He touched her face gently. If you want a partner. In ranching or in life? Both, preferably. Though I should warn you, I'm difficult to live with. Ask Diego. Clara laughed, and it felt like releasing 3 months of tension. I'm difficult too. Ask anyone in Valley Creek. Then we'll be difficult together. He pulled her close again, and Clara let herself lean into him, let herself feel safe for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach. They spent that night talking, real talking, the kind that happens when people stop being careful and start being honest. Ethan told her about his own struggles when he'd first started ranching, about the year he'd nearly lost everything, about the loneliness of working land with no one to share it with. Clara told him about Philadelphia, about the factory, about the man who'd betrayed her, about all the fears she'd been carrying that made this ranch feel like both an opportunity and a test she was terrified of failing. "You haven't failed," Ethan said firmly. "You've done something most people couldn't do. You've survived, more than survived. You've adapted. You've become exactly what this land needed." "What about what I need?" He smiled. "You need someone who won't try to change you, who won't expect you to be anything other than who you are, who'll work beside you, not above you or below you, but beside you." He took her hand. "I can be that person, if you'll let me." Clara squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, the strength that came from the same kind of work she'd been learning. "I'll let you." The next morning, Carson finalized the sale. 30 head of cattle at premium rate, plus the contract for monthly deliveries over the next 6 months. When Clara saw the final numbers, she had to read them twice to believe them. Not only would she make the bank payment, she'd have enough left over to buy winter supplies, repair the barn roof properly, and maybe, finally, get a real bed instead of sleeping on a bedroll. "You've earned this," Carson said as he handed her the payment draft. "Not many could do what you did, man or woman." "Thank you, sir." "Thank the land. It didn't kill you, which means it probably approves." He shook her hand with genuine respect. "I'll see you in a month, Miss Whitmore. Same terms, same rate." Clara and Ethan began the journey back to the valley together, riding side by side through country that looked different in the daylight without a storm threatening. The mountains were sharp and beautiful against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The snow sparkled. Even the cold felt clean rather than cruel. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked after a long stretch of comfortable silence. "I'm thinking about that first day, when you rode to my ranch and told me I was going to die out here." Clara smiled. "You were very certain." "I was wrong. It happens occasionally." "Only occasionally?" "Very occasionally." He reached over and took her hand. "But I'm glad I was wrong. The valley needs someone like you, someone too stubborn to accept reality." "The valley? Or you?" "Both." They rode on, and Clara thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 3 months ago. That woman had been desperate and afraid and completely unprepared for what she was facing. That woman would have looked at the current Clara, weather-hardened, cattle-wise, riding confidently through mountain country, and wouldn't have recognized herself. But Clara recognized her, recognized the fear that had driven her here, the determination that had kept her going, the hope that had refused to die, no matter how many times reality tried to kill it. That woman hadn't disappeared. She'd transformed. They reached the valley on the 4th day, and Clara saw her ranch from the ridge with new eyes. It still looked shabby compared to Ethan's property. The barn still needed work. The house still had that collapsed roof section. The fences were still a patchwork of repairs. But it was hers, and it was surviving. The town reacted to her success with mixed feelings. Some, like Diego and a few of the other ranchers, were genuinely pleased. Others, like Davis, were resentful in that particular way of people who'd bet against someone and lost. Garrett was philosophical about it. "You've proved something," he said when Clara and Ethan stopped by his ranch to report the successful drive. "Not sure what exactly, but something. The valley's got room for people with your kind of determination." "Does that mean I'm officially a rancher now?" Clara asked. Garrett smiled. "I'd say so, though you might want to work on that barn before winter. It's still an embarrassment." Mitchell, when Clara paid off a significant portion of her debt at the bank, looked genuinely shocked. "I didn't think you'd make it," he admitted. "I'm glad I was wrong." "Everyone's glad they were wrong," Clara said. "It's becoming a theme." The bank manager was less pleased. He'd probably been looking forward to foreclosing, but couldn't argue with the payment. "You've bought yourself time," he said coldly. "Don't waste it." "I won't." Over the next weeks, Clara and Ethan fell into a new rhythm. She still ran her own ranch. She'd worked too hard for independence to give it up. But they worked together on larger projects, repairing her barn roof, reinforcing the fence lines, preparing for the next cattle drive, planning how to combine their herds for maximum efficiency. And in the evenings, after the work was done, they'd sit on Clara's porch, now reinforced and no longer sagging, and talk about the future, about expanding the herds, about what the railroad contract would mean long term, about whether they wanted to stay in the valley or eventually move to larger operations elsewhere. "I want to stay," Clara said one evening as the sun set over the mountains. "This place tried to kill me, but it also made me who I am. I'm not ready to leave that." "Good," Ethan said, "because I have no intention of leaving either. Diego would kill me if I made him move. Would he come with you?" "Diego goes where the work is interesting and the boss isn't insufferable. Right now, that's here." Ethan pulled her closer. "But Clara, if we're going to do this, really do this, build a life together, we need to talk about the practical side." "Such as?" "Such as whether you want to merge the properties or keep them separate, whether you want to get married or just partner in business, whether you want to rebuild your house or move into mine." He paused. "I'm not trying to take over your ranch. I need you to know that. I respect what you've built here, what it means to you, but I also know that combining resources would make both our operations stronger." Claire had been thinking about this for days, running through scenarios and options in her mind. "I want to merge the properties," she said slowly, "but I want both houses maintained. We can live in yours, it's in better shape, but I want mine repaired and kept functional, as a reminder of where I started, what I survived." "That's reasonable." "And I want my name on everything, not just as your wife if we marry, but as an equal partner. Clara Whitmore, rancher, not just Ethan Hale's wife who happens to work cattle." Ethan smiled. "Clara, I watched you drive 30 head of cattle through a mountain storm alone. I watched you refuse to quit when quitting was the smart choice. I watched you become one of the best natural ranchers I've ever seen in 3 months of brutal learning. You think I'd reduce you to just someone's wife?" "Some men would." "I'm not some men." He turned to face her fully. "And yes, I want to marry you. Not because you need protecting or saving or managing, but because I've spent 35 years working this land alone, and I'm tired of alone. I want a partner, an equal, someone who will challenge me and push me and make me better." His voice softened. "I want you, Clara. All of you. The stubborn seamstress from Philadelphia who refused to give up. The rancher who rides into storms. The woman who transformed herself because the alternative was unacceptable. All of it." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. The good kind. The kind that came from something breaking open in her chest that had been closed for too long. "Yes." "Yes, to which part?" "Yes, to all of it. Merging the properties, being partners, getting married, building a life here." She kissed him, slow and certain. "Yes, to the future we're creating." They were married 3 weeks later in the same church where the ranchers' meeting had been held. It was a small ceremony. Diego stood up for Ethan, and Mrs. Garrett, Thomas's wife, stood up for Clara. Most of the valley attended, more out of curiosity than celebration, but Clara didn't care. She stood in front of the preacher in a dress she'd made herself from fabric she'd bought with her first profits, looked at Ethan in his best suit, and promised to build a life with him that honored both their strengths. The valley slowly accepted her. Not all at once, not easily, but gradually. Her success at the railroad contract helped. The fact that her cattle stayed healthy through the next winter helped more. By the following spring, when she rode in the valley roundup beside Ethan, managing her own herd with a competence that impressed even the skeptics, she'd earned something more valuable than acceptance. She'd earned respect. Davis never quite forgave her for proving him wrong, but even he stopped making comments about how long she'd last. Garrett started asking her opinion on valley matters. The other ranchers treated her as one of them, rather than an outsider playing at a role she didn't understand. But the real change wasn't in how others saw her. It was in how Clara saw herself. She'd stopped thinking of herself as a seamstress pretending to be a rancher. She'd stopped waiting for someone to expose her as a fraud. She'd stopped feeling like she was temporarily inhabiting a role until the real owner showed up. She was a rancher, not because of her marriage to Ethan, not because of the land she'd inherited, but because she'd earned it through work and determination and refusing to accept failure. The railroad contract lasted the promised 6 months and then was extended. The combined Hale-Whitmore operation became one of the most reliable suppliers in the region. They expanded their herd, improved their grazing lands, made strategic purchases of neighboring properties as other ranchers gave up and moved on. Clara's original ranch house was repaired and maintained just as she'd wanted. Sometimes, when the work was particularly hard or the challenges particularly overwhelming, she'd ride over there and stand on the porch that no longer sagged. She'd look at the barn with its new roof, the fences that stood straight, the corrals that held healthy cattle, and she'd remember that first night. The fear, the overwhelming sense of impossibility, the certainty that she was going to fail. She'd remember the woman she'd been, and she'd honor that woman by being the person that woman had needed to become. One evening, almost a year after her arrival in the valley, Clara and Ethan sat on the porch of their house. She thought of it as their house now, not his, watching the sun set over the mountains. Diego was in the barn, singing in Spanish as he worked. The cattle were settled for the night. The land was peaceful in that particular way that comes after a day of hard work well done. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked quietly. "Staying here, choosing this life?" Clara thought about Philadelphia, about the factory, and the boarding house, and the narrow streets, and the life she'd left behind. She thought about the woman she'd been then, desperate, afraid, running from everything and toward nothing. "No," she said firmly. "This land tried to kill me. It tested me every single day. It demanded everything I had and then demanded more. But it also gave me something Philadelphia never could." "What's that?" "A choice." Clara leaned against him, solid and warm and real. "In Philadelphia, I was surviving day to day with no control over my future. Here, I'm building something. Every fence I repair, every cow I save, every storm I survive, those are choices I'm making. This life is mine in a way nothing's ever been mine before. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The difficulty is what makes it worth having." She smiled. "Besides, I have a good partner. That helps." "Just good?" "Adequate, at least." Ethan laughed and pulled her closer, and Clara looked out at the valley that had tried to reject her and failed. The land she'd claimed not through inheritance, but through work. The future she'd built not because it was given to her, but because she'd fought for it. She'd arrived here 3 months ago with nothing but a battered trunk, a few dollars, and a telegram that had felt like a death sentence. She'd been a seamstress from Philadelphia who'd never ridden a horse, never handled cattle, never imagined she could survive in a place this harsh. That woman was gone. In her place was Clara Whitmore Hale, rancher, wife, partner, survivor. Someone who belonged to this land because she'd earned it. The inheritance she'd never wanted had become the life she'd choose every single day. The valley that was supposed to break her had forged her instead. And looking at the mountains turning gold in the sunset, feeling Ethan's warmth beside her, hearing the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into evening, Clara understood something fundamental about survival. It wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest or the most prepared. It was about refusing to quit, about transforming fear into determination, obstacles into challenges, impossibility into possibility. The land hadn't spared her. It had tested her in every way it knew how, and she'd passed. Not perfectly, not easily, but completely. She was home. And nothing. Not the bank, not the doubters, not the harsh Colorado winters, not the struggles that would certainly come. Nothing was going to take that away from her. She'd inherited a dying farm. A silent cowboy next door had helped change her fate. But the real change, the one that mattered most, was the one she'd made in herself. And that was a legacy worth keeping.